Stephanie White just cost the Indiana Fever another game that was completely winnable, and what she did in those final minutes is the kind of decision that makes fans want to rip their hair out, because this isn't just one mistake, this is a dangerous pattern that's crushing Caitlin Clark's legacy before it even has a chance to reach its full potential. White has been on the sidelines all season, making choices that feel less like strategy and more like sabotage, and the Dallas Wings exposed her in brutal fashion last night. They came out locked and aggressive and ready, while White's Fever looked lost, like a team without a leader. And it wasn't because the players lacked effort. It was because their coach once again threw a winning formula in the trash and replaced it with something that made zero sense. She abandoned the system that had just brought them success and instead doubled down on her own stubborn ideas, and the result was a complete collapse. Fever fans, you need to understand, this is bigger than one game Stephanie White is coaching. Like, it's still the 92nd, while the rest of the league has moved into 2025. And every single time she makes these reckless decisions, she is stealing moments from Caitlin Clark's career, moments that should be legendary but are being wasted under a coach who refuses to adapt. If this doesn't change soon, we're not just talking about losses in the standings, we're talking about Caitlin Clark's prime years being thrown away, and that is something the Fever cannot afford to let happen. Let me break down exactly how Stephanie White proved she's completely out of her depth against Dallas, because the game before the Fever ran one of the cleanest offensive systems we've seen all season. Kelsey Mitchell and Sophie Cunningham were handling point guard duties, the ball was moving, players were cutting, everything clicked, and they walked away with a win. So naturally, you'd think White would double down on what clearly worked right-wrong. Instead, she threw that entire game plan in the trash and handed the keys to Odyssey Sims. A player who hadn't been on a roster all season long, she gave her 13 crucial minutes. Even though Sims looked out of shape, unprepared, and completely lost on both ends of the court, 4 missed shots, sloppy turnovers, A-4 in the box score, it told the whole story. But somehow White stuck with her while their best defensive player, Lexi Hull, sat on the bench watching disaster unfold. This is vintage Stephanie White. She finds something that works and immediately abandons it just to prove how smart she thinks she is. She would rather lose with her system than win with her players. And last night, Dallas made her pay for it. Let me break down exactly how Stephanie White proved she's completely out of her depth against Dallas, because the game before the Fever ran one of the cleanest offensive systems we've seen all season. Kelsey Mitchell and Sophie Cunningham were handling point guard duties, the ball was moving, players were cutting, everything clicked, and they walked away with a win. So naturally, you'd think White would double down on what clearly worked right-wrong. Instead, she threw that entire game plan in the trash and handed the keys to Odyssey Sims. A player who hadn't been on a roster all season long, she gave her 13 crucial minutes. Even though Sims looked out of shape, unprepared, and completely lost on both ends of the court, 4 missed shots, sloppy turnovers, A-4 in the box score, it told the whole story. But somehow White stuck with her while their best defensive player, Lexi Hull, sat on the bench watching disaster unfold. This is vintage Stephanie White. She finds something that works and immediately abandons it just to prove how smart she thinks she is. She would rather lose with her system than win with her players. And last night, Dallas made her pay for it. White keeps saying she needs a true point guard to organize the team, but the Dallas game before proved that's just not true. Kelsey Mitchell was dropping dimes. Sophie Cunningham was making smart reads, the offense was flowing, and everyone looked comfortable. But instead of letting that system breathe, White forced her control back into the game. She's like that micromanaging boss who can't stand seeing anyone succeed unless it's done exactly her way. And when it blows up, she points fingers at the players, not herself, and the proof is in her rotation choices. Lexi Hull, their best perimeter defender, gets yanked in and out of lineups like she's some bench warmer fighting for scraps, when in reality, she can lock down anyone on the court, make the right decisions, and bring an energy that shifts the game. Meanwhile, White keeps giving opportunities to players who clearly don't fit the team's needs. It's almost like she's more interested in proving a point than actually winning. And the only veteran consistently standing up for Clark out there is Sophie Cunningham. She's the one who gets physical when opponents target their star. She's the one showing there are consequences for disrespecting Clark, but White keeps sidelining the players who protect and elevate Clark while rewarding players who bring nothing but chaos and chemistry issues. And that's not just bad coaching, that's reckless leadership. This is where it gets dangerous because Stephanie White isn't just making bad substitutions, she's actively changing the way Caitlin Clark plays the game. In her recent interview, Clark admitted White pulls her for risky passes, and she even smiled about how she stopped making certain plays because she didn't want to get benched. Think about how backwards that is. You've got a generational player who built her name on logo threes and impossible passes, and now she's second, guessing herself because her coach is brainwashing her into playing it safe. That's like telling Steph Curry to stop shooting from deep because it's low percentage. Those so-called risky plays are what make Clark special. They're what draw millions of fans. They're what made the Fever relevant again. But White is stripping that away piece by piece, turning her into a cautious point guard who plays not to make mistakes, instead of playing to win. And the saddest part is Clark respects White. She trusts this process, and she doesn't even realize she's being molded into something ordinary instead of revolutionary. Every single game, you can see the pattern. Stephanie White has no feel for momentum. She pulls hot players at the worst times, leaves cold players on the floor when it matters most, and makes substitutions that kill any rhythm the team builds. The Dallas game was the perfect example. Lexi Hull had the best plus-minus on the roster. She was locking down her matchup and making smart plays, but White reduced her minutes just to give Odyssey Sims more run. When Hull finally got a chance in the fourth quarter, she went one-on-one with Paige Buchers and completely shut her down. That should have been the adjustment, but instead, White doubled down on her mistakes. It's the same story over and over. She coaches like someone who has no understanding of game flow, no instinct for how to close games, and no awareness of how her decisions sabotage her own players. The Fever clawed back from 17 points down to within 1, and instead of letting the energy ride, White's choices slammed the door shut, proving again she's her own team's biggest obstacle. Let's be honest about who Stephanie White really is as a coach, because her track record tells the whole story. At Vanderbilt, she was a disaster. 46 wins, 83 losses across 5 seasons, and it was always the players' fault at UConn. She barely lasted 2 years before they said thanks but no thanks. And now she's in Indiana, showing the exact same patterns. Bad rotations, bad timeouts, zero accountability, and an arrogance that makes her think she's smarter than everyone else. The results prove otherwise. She's a mediocre coach who somehow keeps getting chance after chance. She talks like a strategist, but coaches like someone stuck in the 92nd. And the worst part is, the Fever front office knew this. They saw her losing record, they saw her failed stints, and they still handed her the keys to a roster built around the most important player in women's basketball, Caitlin Clark. Instead of maximizing her, they hired a coach who is actively limiting her growth, and that is a mistake the Fever can't afford to let drag on. What makes this even worse is the players White chooses to ride with versus the ones she constantly sidelines, because Lexi Hull should be a cornerstone. She's their best perimeter defender. She hustles, she makes smart reads, she impacts, winning in ways that don't always show up in the box score. But instead of empowering her, White treats her like a role player, fighting for scraps. Meanwhile, she hands minutes to players who bring no chemistry, and in some cases, even open hostility toward Caitlin Clark. How does that make sense? Clark needs teammates who protect her and elevate her, not ones who drag her down. The truth is, Sophie Cunningham is the only veteran who consistently goes to battle for Clark. She's the one setting the tone physically. She's the one stepping in when Clark gets targeted. She's the one showing opponents they can't just push Indiana's star around. But White keeps minimizing the very players who buy in and fight for Clark, while prioritizing players who fit her outdated system. That's not just bad coaching, that's sabotaging the franchise cornerstone. Stephanie White is coaching like it's 1,995, not 2025, and every game she runs this outdated system, she is shrinking. Caitlin Clark's greatness, instead of unleashing it, the Fever have the core to be special. Hull, Cunningham, Mitchell, Boston. That's a championship nucleus when Clark is healthy. But with White in charge, it's being wasted because she refuses to adapt and refuses to maximize what she has. And if Indiana doesn't make a move soon, don't be surprised if Clark herself starts questioning whether her prime years are being thrown away. Because no superstar wants to spend their career trapped under a coach who doesn't understand them. White has already shown us at Vanderbilt. She failed at UConn. She failed. And now, in Indiana, She's repeating the exact same story. 3 stops, 3 disasters, the evidence is undeniable. And the longer she stays, the closer the Fever get to losing not just games, but the trust of the most important player in women's basketball history. At this point, Fever fans have to ask themselves how many more games need to be wasted before the front office wakes up. Stephanie White has had 3 different chances to prove she can coach at this level, and every single time the results have been the same excuses: bad rotations, wasted talent, and no accountability. Caitlin Clark is too important to the league and too important to this franchise to let her prime years slip away under a coach who doesn't understand her. Greatness. Indiana has the pieces to compete for championships right now, but that requires a leader who actually knows how to maximize their stars, not one who drags them down. So the question isn't whether Stephanie White should be fired, it's how long are the Fever willing to risk losing their future by keeping her in charge, because every game she coaches is another step toward turning Caitlin Clark from revolutionary to ordinary, and that is a tragedy the WNBA simply cannot afford.